The statistical probability of a cowboy dying in a shootout at high noon is effectively zero. The number of recorded walk-down gunfights in the history of the West can be counted on two hands. Hollywood sold you the story of lead poisoning from a Colt 45. The reality is that the West was not tamed by the gun, it was tamed by the fence, and the fence killed more men than the gun ever did. The killer was not a bullet. It was a spore. Clostridium tetani, tetanus, lockjaw. It lived in the soil. It lived specifically and prolifically in horse manure. The cowboy's entire existence was conducted in a biological cloud of tetanus spores. He rode horses, he walked in corrals, he slept on the ground. But the spore needs a delivery system. It needs a portal. A bullet hole is actually a poor portal for tetanus. The heat of the slug cauterizes the tissue, and the profuse bleeding washes the wound out. A knife cut is a poor portal. It opens the flesh to the air. Tetanus is anaerobic. Oxygen kills it. It needs a deep, narrow, dirty puncture that seals itself shut. Enter Joseph Glidden. In 1874, he patented the perfect delivery system. He called it the winner. The world called it barbed wire. The Indians called it the devil's rope. To understand the mortality rate, you have to look at the mechanics of the wire itself. Glidden's design used two strands of wire twisted together to hold the barbs in place. The barbs were sharp, short, and inevitably rusty. The rust is crucial. Rust does not cause tetanus. That is a myth. But rust creates a rough, pitted surface that holds microscopic particles of dirt. Dirt holds manure. Manure holds the spore. The rusty barb is a microscopic Trojan horse waiting to breach the fortress of the skin. When a cowboy was stretching fence, a task that consumed 50% of his working life after the open range closed in the 1880s, the wire was under thousands of pounds of tension. They used a tool called a fence stretcher or a come-along. It was a system of levers and clamps. If the wire snapped or if the clamp slipped, the wire whipped back faster than the human eye could process. It didn't cut like a razor. It tore. It punched deep, ragged holes into leather gloves, denim, and muscle. It injected the spore deep into the fascia, where the blood supply was poor and the oxygen was low. Or consider the corral work. A horse panics. It crushes the cowboy against the fence. The barbs puncture his thigh or his hand. The cowboy curses. He wraps a dirty bandana around it. He spits tobacco juice on it, which does absolutely nothing for spores, and keeps working. The wound bleeds a little, then scabs over. The cowboy thinks he is fine. He's dead. He just has an incubation period of 3 to 21 days to settle his affairs. The death toll from tetanus in the agricultural and ranching sectors of the late 19th century dwarfed the homicide rate. Forensic historians estimate that for every man killed by a bullet in the cattle towns, 3 to 4 died of blood poisoning or lockjaw on the range. The bullet kills instantly or misses. The wire never misses, and the spore never fails. Let's walk through the pathology of a tetanus death in 1885. It is a death of absolute, conscious horror. The bacteria enters the puncture wound. It finds a pocket of dead tissue where there is no oxygen. It begins to multiply. As it multiplies, it excretes a neurotoxin called tetanospasmin. This is one of the most potent poisons known to man. The lethal dose is measured in nanograms. The toxin travels up the nervous system via the axons, moving about 1/4 of an inch an hour. It attacks the motor neurons. Specifically, it blocks the inhibitory neurotransmitters in the spinal cord. In plain English, your muscles have an on switch and an off switch. Tetanus destroys the off switch. Your body becomes a machine with the throttle stuck at maximum. The first sign is usually the jaw. The masseter muscles, the strongest muscles in the body, pound for pound, designed to crush steak, spasm and lock. The cowboy can't open his mouth. He can't eat. He can't speak. This is why they called it lockjaw. The ranch doctor, if there is one, might think it's a toothache. He pulls a tooth. It does nothing. The problem isn't the tooth. It's the nerve signal. Then the risus sardonicus sets in. The facial muscles spasm into a fixed, terrifying grin. The eyebrows raise. The corners of the mouth pull back violently. The man looks like he is laughing maniacally, but he is in agony. This sardonic smile was the signature of the disease. When a foreman saw a hand with that smile, he knew he was looking at a corpse. There was no unseeing it. The escalation is rapid. The spasms move down the neck, into the back, and into the abdomen. The cramps are not like a Charlie horse. They are powerful enough to tear muscle fibers. They are powerful enough to crush vertebrae. The most gruesome symptom is opisthothonos. The back muscles are stronger than the stomach muscles. When they both spasm at once, the back wins. The body arches backward into a bridge. The man is supported only by his heels and the back of his head. His body becomes a rigid bow of bone and muscle. The sensory cruelty of tetanus is that it does not affect the mind. The man is fully conscious. He is not delirious. He feels every fiber of his muscle tearing. He knows he is dying, and the spasms are triggered by sensory input. A loud noise, a bright light, a touch, or even a draft of air across the room can trigger a full-body seizure that stops the breathing. The diaphragm locks. The man suffocates while fully awake. The medical treatment in 1880 was a theater of helplessness. The germ theory was young. Most ranch doctors were Civil War vets who believed in miasma or bad air. They didn't know about the spore. They saw the wound had healed over. They didn't connect the scratch from 2 weeks ago to the seizure, today. They treated the symptoms, not the cause. Once the lockjaw set in, the standard protocol was the quiet room. They would put the cowboy in a dark cabin or a dugout. They would lay straw on the floor to dampen the sound of footsteps. They would plug every crack with mud to stop drafts. And they would wait. They fed him water or milk through a quill or a rubber tube pushed through the gap in his teeth. Sometimes, if the jaw was clamped too tight, they would knock out a front tooth with a chisel just to get the tube in. This was an act of mercy. They used sedatives, chloral hydrate, morphine, large doses of whiskey. None of it stopped the toxin. It just knocked the man out between seizures. If he was lucky, he died of asphyxiation quickly. If he was unlucky, he died of exhaustion and starvation over the course of 2 weeks. The caloric burn of constant muscle contraction is massive. The body literally burns itself out, consuming its own fat and muscle to fuel the spasms. The comparative statistics are revealing. In Dodge City, during its most violent year, 1878, there were 5 killings. 5. That same year, in the surrounding Ford County, there were dozens of deaths listed as accidental, blood poisoning, or cramps. The coroner's ledgers hide the truth. Congestion of the brain was a common euphemism for the final stages of tetanus. Inflammation of the bowels often masked the abdominal rigidity of the disease. The economic cost of barbed wire injuries was a line item that ranch managers tried to ignore. A seasoned cowboy was a skilled laborer. He was paid $30 to $40 a month, roughly $1,000 to $200 today. But his value was in his skill. Replacing him cost time. When a man got scratched, the foreman didn't send him to the doctor. A doctor visited cost money, $5 to $10. A bandage was free. The culture of toughness was an economic trap. To complain about a scratch was to be weak. So they wrapped it in a dirty rag, introducing more bacteria, and kept working. This stoicism was the vector of infection. The fence gangs were the infantry of this war. Large ranches like the XIT in Texas fenced 3 million acres. That is 6,000 miles of wire. The crews lived in wagons. They handled the wire all day. Their hands were a map of scars. They were walking petri dishes. The bacteria, C. tetani, can survive in the soil for decades. It is dormant. It waits. The moment the wire pierced the skin, the clock started. Consider the hygiene of the bunkhouse. There was none. Men washed once a week. They wore the same clothes for months. They used the same blankets. If a man had a festering wound, it was exposed to the filth of the communal living space. But tetanus isn't contagious. You can't catch it from your bunkmate. You catch it from the environment. This made it seem random. 2 men get cut. One heals. One arches his back and dies screaming. They attributed it to luck or God or bad whiskey. They didn't know it was a matter of oxygen depth. The man who bled freely lived. The man whose wound closed up died. The cures sold by the patent medicine frauds exacerbated the problem. They sold salves and ointments to seal the wound. Sealing the wound is exactly what the bacteria wants. Vaseline, bear grease, or tar applied to a puncture wound creates the perfect anaerobic seal for the spore to hatch. The medicine killed the patient. The timeline of the cure is the tragedy. The tetanus antitoxin was developed in 1890 by Shibasaburo Kitasato and Emil von Behring in Berlin, but it didn't reach the American West in any significant quantity until World War I. For the entirety of the golden age of the cowboy, 1865 to 1900, there was no cure. The mortality rate for generalized tetanus was over 50%, even with the best hospital care. On a ranch, miles from help, it was nearly 100%. There is a gruesome anecdote from the Wyoming range wars. A cattleman cut the fences of a sheepman. In the process, the wire snapped and lashed across his face. It didn't blind him, but it hooked his cheek. He pulled it out. He rode home. 10 days later, he was at a saloon. He tried to drink a shot of rye and couldn't open his mouth. He thought he had a cold. By midnight, he was on the floor of the saloon arching. The patrons thought he was having a fit of delirium tremens from alcohol withdrawal. They laughed at him. They dragged him into a back room to sleep it off. He was dead by morning. The wire had killed him as surely as if the sheepman had shot him, but with a 10-day delay and maximum suffering. The fence-cutting wars of Texas in 1883 add another layer to this. Small ranchers, cut off from water by the massive enclosures of the syndicates, formed gangs to cut the wire. They worked at night. They used nippers. Snapping a tensioned wire in the dark is dangerous. The wire coils back unpredictably. Men were lashed, punctured, and cut. The casualties of this war were rarely gunshot victims. They were victims of the wire itself. A cut leg in a muddy field in 1883 was a death sentence. The shift in the industry from open range to fenced ranching changed the risk profile. In the open range days, the risk was the stampede or the horsefall. In the fenced era, the risk was the infrastructure. The wire was a machine. It had no mercy. It didn't just enclose the cattle, it enclosed the cowboy. It turned the profession from a nomadic lifestyle into an industrial maintenance job. And maintenance jobs have accident rates. The Widowmaker wasn't a Colt revolver. It was the fence stretcher. This tool, used to pull the wire tight, was a lever under immense tension. If the gear slipped, the handle could shatter a jaw. If the wire snapped, it could decapitate. But the silent killer was the rust. The rust didn't cause tetanus, but it created the microenvironment for it. Let's look at the dollar value of a limb. In the 1880s, there was no workers' compensation. If you lost a hand to gangrene or the wire, you were fired. A one-handed cowboy is a liability. There were no pensions. The old cowboys you see in photos are rare because the profession ground them up. If the wire didn't kill them, it crippled them. A stiff hand, a frozen tendon from a deep puncture, these were career-ending injuries. The poverty rate among retired ranch hands was absolute. The irony of the Wild West is that the thing that civilized it, the fence, brought a death more savage than the wilderness. The Native Americans feared the wire because it stopped the buffalo. The cowboys feared it because it ended the drive. But the body feared it because it was a needle injecting liquid death. When you drive through Texas or Montana today, you see thousands of miles of three-strand barbed wire. It looks benign. It looks like a border. But to the forensic historian, it looks like a weapon of mass destruction that operated in slow motion for 40 years. The statistic of 3x more deaths is a conservative estimate derived from comparing the burial records of natural causes versus gunshot wounds. In many church graveyards, you will see row after row of young men, aged 20 to 30. No cause of death listed, just a date. If you dig into the local newspaper archives of that week, you find the obituary, taken by a sudden cramp, or after a brief illness following an accident. That is the code for the wire. The gunfight was a choice. You could walk away, you could apologize, you could leave town. The wire was not a choice. It was the job. And the spore didn't care about your reputation. It only cared about your blood count. So, when you picture the cowboy, don't picture him with a hand hovering over a holster. Picture him with a pair of fencing pliers, looking at a rusty barb, wondering if the scratch on his thumb is going to make him smile that terrible, sardonic smile for the last 3 days of his life. That was the real fear, the fear of the invisible, the fear of the dirt. Let's examine the specific vectors of infection in the daily life of a ranch hand. The most common vector was the boot. Cowboy boots were not fashion statements. They were tools. They were made of leather, often ill-fitting. A cowboy walking a fence line would often step on a scrap of wire hidden in the grass. The punji stick effect. The wire goes through the sole, into the foot. The foot is a hot, damp environment inside a leather boot. It is the perfect incubator. The cowboy pulls the wire out, maybe pours some whiskey in the boot, and keeps walking. The puncture in the sole of the boot ensures that every subsequent step pumps more manure-laden dust into the wound. The foot puncture had a staggering mortality rate because it was impossible to keep clean. Then there is the branding season. Branding is chaos, dust, smoke, burning hair, and stressed animals. A calf kicks, a cowboy falls into the dirt. He cuts his hand on a branding iron or a chute latch. The dust in a branding corral is roughly 50% dried manure. It is an aerosolized cloud of tetanus spores. The cowboy breathes it in, which is fine, but he also rubs it into his open cuts. The combination of thermal burns from the iron and puncture wounds from the fence equipment created complex injuries that were nightmares for the immune system. The Chisholm Trail and other cattle drives were moving vectors. As the herds moved north, they left a trail of manure. They also left a trail of dead cattle. The decomposition of carcasses creates a rich bacterial environment. A cowboy skinning a dead cow, a common task to salvage the hide for a few dollars, was exposing himself to every pathogen the animal carried. If he nicked his hand with the skinning knife, he was introducing a cocktail of bacteria directly into his bloodstream. Anthrax was a risk, yes, but tetanus was the statistical winner. The psychological toll of the lockjaw death on the other men in the bunkhouse cannot be overstated. Watching a friend die of a gunshot is traumatic, but it is fast. Watching a friend die of tetanus is a slow-motion torture session that lasts for days. It destroyed morale. There are diary entries from range cooks describing the sound of the dying man in the wagon, the grunting, the snapping of teeth, the arching of the back against the floorboards. It was a sound that haunted the camps. It made men quit. It made men superstitious. They would start washing their cuts with turpentine or kerosene, desperate to avoid the cramps. The kerosene treatment is worth a forensic note. Coal oil, it was the universal solvent of the frontier. Cowboys would pour it on cuts. It burned like hell. Did it work? Marginally. It was an antiseptic, but it also damaged the tissue. Dead tissue is what tetanus loves. So, in some cases, the cure actually created the necrotic pocket the bacteria needed to thrive. They were damned if they did, damned if they didn't. And let's not forget the doctor's bag. If a doctor did arrive, his instruments were not sterile. He might have just lanced a boil on a horse, wiped the knife on his pants, and then used it to probe the cowboy's wire cut. The concept of cross-contamination was unknown. The doctor himself was often the vector, carrying the spores from patient to patient on his unwashed hands and tools. The legacy of Joseph Glidden is complicated. He made agriculture in the arid West possible. Without the fence, you cannot farm. The cattle will eat your crops. Without the fence, you cannot improve bloodlines. The scrub bulls will breed your prize cows. The fence was civilization, but the cost of that civilization was paid in the blood of the men who installed it. The Devil's Rope was an apt name. It strangled the open range, and it strangled the men who closed it. In the final analysis, the gunfighter is a mythic figure, a solitary warrior. The fence rider is the tragic reality. He was a laborer, paid a pittance, who fought a war against geometry and biology every single day. His enemy was the tension of the wire and the bacteria in the soil. And in that war, there were no truces, no surrenders, and no glory. Only the silent, rigid grin of the defeat. The next time you see a roll of rusty barbed wire rotting in a field, don't see it as a piece of nostalgia. See it as a biological weapon. See it as the mechanism that killed the cowboy, not with a bang, but with a spasm. The West wasn't won by the Winchester. It was won by the wire, and the wire took no prisoners.